Hello, welcome. I'm here today to ask the question, what does Tacitus say about Christ and Christians? You may ask, who's Tacitus and why should we care? So we'll be looking at that first. Hope you like the background. Usually anyone does a video like this and tries to do anything bookish with it, and they'll have a big display of books, like a big personal library behind them. I'm not going to do that. Not least because my bookshelves are a bomb site if you saw them, and there is nowhere to put a chair, but at least it makes a difference from everyone doing the same thing. Oh look, books, it makes me look like super educated. So who was Tacitus and why does it matter? Well, he was a historian about 2,000 years ago. After the time of Christ, born in the 50s of the first century and born in Italy. So whereas Christ had died 20 odd years earlier in Judea, but he was a historian. Historians write about the past and he was a lot closer to it than we are, so it's worth hearing what he's got to say. He would be able to research sources that we don't have access to. Born in Italy, his language was Latin. So if you've never read Latin, don't worry, we'll go through this in a way that hopefully you'll find helpful. And his most famous work was written early in the 2nd century, and the stuff that we're looking at today published around about 116 AD. Some people say CE, but I'm going to say AD in this video because for most people that's easier to figure out what I'm doing. So Tacitus, Roman historian, wrote in Latin, born in Italy, but well-travelled. He served time in the east of the Roman Empire, in Asia, and he would have regarded as Israel, Judea, all those areas as being out east. So Tacitus wrote a number of books, including the Annals, which is what we're going to look at today. He wrote other stuff, which tells us about the Roman conquest of Britain, which is fantastic, the earliest documentary witness we've got to that. But here we're looking at what he tells us about Christ and Christians. He only tells us a tiny amount, much less than he knows about other things, but it's useful. I'm interested in it because I am interested in the study of the origins of Christianity. I am a Christian. I'm educated to master's level, shortly to begin a PhD in early church history at a secular university. Because for me all these things are of interest. I love to know where things have come from. History is great. Did my family history, went back in time. Love my football club, so I read their history. Did that years ago. I've just got this natural bent to know where do things come from and why does it matter. So I hope this is of interest to you, because it does shed a little bit of light in how the Roman elite had a little window of insight into Christ and Christians. Only a small one, but every little counts. Nothing world-changing depends on this, but it's interesting to know. Because in the first 100 years or so of Christianity, we have lots of Christian writings. Some of them are included in the New Testament, and there's others as well that we have. A Jewish historian called Josephus mentions Jesus Christ. That's a lot more complicated. I might cover that in another video. Tacitus mentions Christ. It's a lot simpler. Deal with that one in this video. So the passage, you don't have to be able to read Latin to read this passage on Tacitus. There are plenty of English translations. You might have access to a textbook, which is how we all did it in the old days, but nowadays it's all online. Here's a few images for you. You can just look at English translations of it, but they do tend to be trying to turn difficult Latin into straightforward English, so you have to allow a bit, be aware that that's what they're doing. You can look at Latin and English side by side. You could just look at the Latin, you could look at the Latin with notes underneath, and so on. So if you want to get into that, you can. You don't have to speak or read Latin, but there's tools there that will help you. And the reason it's of interest is Tacitus has got this really individual style, extremely difficult for anyone to copy, unless they're pretty good at Latin in the first place. Extremely compact. Trying to think of an example to compare with. Not an exact parallel by any means, but if you imagine in English we might say the cat sat on the mat. If you want to do a really compact version of that, cat on mat. That's compact, cat on mat, as opposed to the cat sat on the mat. Tacitus writes a lot of his Latin really compact and leaves out words that he doesn't think are necessary. Other Latin writers would just include the words. Tacitus and finds ways of scrunching sentences up into the tiny size. So sometimes scholars will read it and will argue about just quite how to interpret this or that sentence. And it has some interesting effects here, but nothing of a huge consequence. So I think that what I want to do is talk about why Tacitus is doing this. And it's really important. There's a lot of nonsense talked on the internet about what Tacitus says about Christ and Christians. And in these videos I like to do a bit of demystifying and myth busting, and I've come across leaning too far one way or the other, people taking more than what Tacitus really says. So for example, I've come across some Christian apologists suggesting that Tacitus is alluding to the resurrection. Well, you can't take that from the text. And I've found some hyper-skeptics, particularly of the persuasion that Jesus never existed, which is a really fringe view. Maybe talk about that one day. But they would want to say, oh no, Tacitus couldn't possibly have written any of this. It must be a forgery. And it's his comments about Christians more than his comments about Christ that are of interest to historians. But I'll cover Christ a little bit more because I think people who read my blog tend to be interested in that. And this is, of all my blogs, well, I'll put a link underneath, but of all my blogs, this is the one that gets the most hits, so I'm sure there's some interest in it. Who won? So this passage in Tacitus, which mentions Christ and Christians, what's it really about? Well, it's actually really about the Great Fire of Rome. Now that happened in 64 AD, historical fact, there's no dispute about that. At the time, the emperor was Nero, bad Emperor Nero, naughty man, and his reign wasn't always a disaster, but in 64 AD there was this massive fire. Rome was very vulnerable to fire, as a lot of ancient cities were, and it caused a huge devastation to vast swathes of the city, and the city had to be rebuilt. So Tacitus records what happened here. Nero got the city built, a little bit more fireproof than it was before, which is good, obviously. And Nero did the other thing that you had to do in those days, which was you plead with your gods to keep your city safe in the future. So if your city's being burned down by fire and you're the emperor, those are the two things. You build it better than before, so it's a bit more fireproof, and you entreat your Roman gods because you're a Roman emperor. And this is how it goes. Such indeed were the precautions of human wisdom. The next thing was to seek means of propitiating the gods, and recourse was had to the Sibylline books, by the direction of which prayers were offered to Vulcanus, Ceres, and Proserpina. Juno too was entreated by the matrons, first in the capital, then on the nearest part of the coast, whence water was procured to sprinkle the fane and image of the goddess, and there were sacred banquets and nightly vigils celebrated by married women. So far so good, all very exotic sounding. All this religious ritual activity, Roman style, was done in the hope that it would safeguard the city because you've got the gods on board now, the gods and goddesses, not just the fire safety, but you've got the Roman gods and goddesses on your side. The city's going to be safe, that's the idea. And Nero is being seen to do his bit, as a good emperor would. But there was a problem. Although he's got earthly and divine protection for his city, Nero's got a problem, another problem. Because there's a rumour, which he regarded, I'm sure, as a very nasty, malicious rumour spread by bad people, was that the city had burned down because the egomaniac Nero had ordered it to be burned down so he could build a new city up according to his fantastic plans. Had Nero done this? We shall never know. But those were the rumours according to Tacitus, and that's bad news for an emperor. As you can imagine these days, think of your prime minister or your president. If there's a rumour not going to go away that your leader's done something really seriously as bad as this, you've got to deal with it or you're finished. As Tacitus says this: but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration, the fire, the conflagration was the result of an order. And that means an order from whom? An order from Nero. That was the rumour. Okay, so here's the thing. A safe city, not enough. You're the Roman emperor, you need a safe reputation too. So your reputation needs to be saved. Needs a different solution. Placating the gods, yeah, great for stopping fires, but what is the time-honoured, or one of the time-honoured ways that a politician will make sure that the guilt goes elsewhere? Find a scapegoat. It's been done by politicians since time immemorial, and that's what Nero does according to Tacitus. Find someone else to blame. Someone the people hate. That works well. Someone who would be capable of terrible things according to the public imagination, because then if they're really bad people, you're just going to believe that they must have started the fire. So Nero's scapegoat was the Christians in Rome. Christians have been in Rome, we know, for at least 10 years, because we have a letter from the early church, an authentic letter recognised by scholars written to Christians in Rome in the 50s of the 1st century. So we know the Christians in Rome, and Tacitus confirms that anyway. But he now needs to explain who the Christians are, because he hasn't mentioned it to his readers prior to this point. And why are they called Christians? So this is what Tacitus says. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. So I'm going to break that down. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero. What does Nero do? Now this common English translation, which you'll find online, says Nero fastened the guilt. That's somebody trying to write good English. The Latin is just 2 words. Tacitus, very compact. And the words kind of mean he substituted defendants for himself. Redidit kind of means he substituted, or something like that. And reos, the accused, the defendants. So really it says Nero substituted defendants for himself and inflicted the most exquisite, and Tacitus does say the most, kind of exquisite, a bit English, but the most, really, really top-class tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. So subdidit reos, a real kind of bitty thing. This is a real put-up charge against the defendants, not that they get a fair trial or anything. And the most exquisite punishments in Latin, and this is great, it's quaestissimis poenis, which sounds so Italian. I'm putting a slight accent on it, but quaestissimis poenia, the most punishments of punishments. Now, if you look at your standard translation here, it will say something like they were called Christians by the populace. Tacitus actually puts it the other way around. Rather than saying they were called Christians by the populace, that's an English translator trying to make it sound more English. Tacitus has actually got the populace called the hated ones Christians. So the populace, the Roman populace, called the hated ones Christians. That's really what it's saying. But here in English you commonly find called Christians by the populace. As a kind of footnote bit at the end, I'll say that the words Christians and Christians were interchangeable then. Christians in those days, 1st centuries of Christianity, commented on it, and Tacitus is probably using that ironically, because Christians was just a word used for followers of Christ. Christians was a word that had another meaning. Christians could be good people, and Tacitus uses the word Christians and then says these are really bad people. So there's probably a play of on words. But what he's actually saying is Christians got their name from Christ. So I'm just going to read a couple of bits of this again, just so we can keep up with ourselves. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero substituted the accused, put up a charge on the defendants, and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on people. The populace called the hated ones Christians, and hated for their abominations. And Tacitus says, the author of the name is Christ, or as your translations often say, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So Christus, Christ, in the Latin, the originator of the name. Tacitus means the originator of the name Christians, because Tacitus presumably thinks that's how it was. Of course, that's not how the Gospels tell it, because the word Christians gets attached to them, to the Jesus movement later, not by Christ himself, but by others. But Tacitus just goes straight in and just says, oh, Christ was the originator of the name of Christians. He's not looking to be overly analysed with that. He's just being quick and straight to the point. He only wants us to know where the word Christians came from. And he suffered execution during the reign of Tiberius. There's just two words in the Latin again, very concise. Pontius Pilate was a prefect during that time. Now Tacitus, writing the following century, says procurator, because in his day it had been procurator for decades, but actually at the time of Pontius Pilate, the title more likely used of him would be prefect. Tacitus, good historian though he is, and he is a good historian, there's probably guilty of a slight anachronism there, using the term that would have been around in his day. Supplicio ad fectus erat. He was afflicted with execution. Supplicio could mean punishment or execution, or even sacrifice. But anyway, supplicio ad fectus erat, it's quite clear that this was an execution. So Christ, the author of the name, was executed. That's it. That's all it says about Christ. But it tells us nothing about what Jesus said or what he did. It doesn't call him Jesus, because he's only trying to do really two things, which is call him Christ to explain where the name Christian comes from, and to blacken his name. It doesn't even tell us what Christ was killed for. He just tells us that he was given the death penalty under a Roman procurator, prefect, in the year of a Roman emperor. In other words, nothing wrong with this execution that Tacitus knows of, but he's now poisoned the idea of who these Christians were before he's even got going. Who wants to be part of a group where the founder that they look back to was executed by the Romans? So what he says is pretty straightforward. It's what the Romans did to Christ, and that's it. There's no suggestion that Tacitus ever even heard of Christian beliefs about the supernatural, or about Christ rising from the dead. There's just nothing in this text like that. Whatever Tacitus may have heard about Christians, he doesn't tell us. In terms of their beliefs, he only tells us that the populace hated them. The populace assumed that they did very bad things, but it's all very vague. Tacitus is probably being deliberately vague. He probably didn't know. And that's quite interesting, because there was another official that Tacitus knew called Pliny. He was also an official at a different moment in time in a different part of the east of the Roman Empire. And Pliny interrogated Christians, and from that he got quite a bit of information about what Christians do. And Pliny noted that they bind themselves to quite moral, honest behaviour. And reading what's coming up next, Tacitus has clearly got no idea. The impression you get is that Tacitus has never met a real Christian. So he just goes with the populace's view that these must be very bad people who do absolutely awful things. At this point, it's worth saying a little bit about the Roman attitude to other religions. In the Roman Empire, they were very good at working with nations that they took over or invaded, of assimilating Roman gods with the gods of the nations they conquered, mixing them all up together, making a new soup out of it. That was fine as far as the Romans were concerned, and that way they didn't completely wipe out the religions of the peoples they conquered, but they Romanized it. But above all, it was important that people be willing to offer honours to the Roman Emperor and to burn incense as if the Roman Emperor was a god. The Christians would not do that. That was an absolute red line for them. And the Christians came out of Judaism. And for the Jews, the same thing, red line, not doing that. Now, the Jews were given a special dispensation for a time by the Romans, that because of the Jews' really strict way of honouring their one God, the God of the Bible, the Romans would respect that and not require the Jews to burn incense. Now, the Christians would gradually, the Christians were not all Jews, so the waters were a bit muddied and they didn't get the same protection. And so you have to look at their religion the way through Romanize, it might have just looked like a foreign religion that was being very uncooperative. It was not sacrificing or offering incense to the Roman Emperor. Tacitus describes them as a nasty, mischievous superstition. It doesn't mean he knows anything about them, it just means they're a foreign religion that is just behaving in an unacceptably un-Roman way. So he calls them a superstitio. It just doesn't mean superstitious in the way that we do it. It doesn't mean like being worried about throwing salt over your shoulder or walking on the cracks in the pavement. It doesn't mean that. It's just a very generic word for a foreign religion that was not a Roman religion, with an overtone of like, these people are not playing ball, these people are not playing by the rules. So he calls it mischievous and so on. So that's how he regards Christianity. He doesn't really tell us anything about it substantially. He doesn't seem to know any Christian beliefs at all. Probably never met a real Christian. Some people might think otherwise, but there's no evidence that he did. And just one last point on that, again, is because of some hyperskeptics have tried to dismiss the validity of Tacitus as a historian on this point by saying he's simply repeating the beliefs of Christians. So there's 2 or 3 points to say to that, and this is very easily addressed. Tacitus doesn't say that for a start. You've got to go with the text, and Tacitus simply states this as a fact. The Romans did this to Christ, full stop. They gave him the death penalty. It was done by Pontius Pilate. It was done in the reign of Tiberius, full stop. There's nothing about whether anyone believes in it. And seriously, if there was Christian beliefs, it would be more to do with what happens afterwards, rising from the dead, but there's nothing about that. So Tacitus is simply saying as a fact what the Romans did to him. And he's not suggesting that he heard it from Christians. And so what happened to the Christians? So Tacitus continues. A most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, that is, Christ was executed. A most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of this evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. So you may get the impression that Tacitus was not into multiculturalism. All the worst things from the world, they all end up in Rome. He can't stand it. That seems to be the way he looks at it. He wants things to be properly Roman. There's some great words here. I love the words. It broke out again. This thing. He doesn't call it Christianity. He just he calls it superstitio. This weird foreign religion that he doesn't know much about. It says it broke out. The actual word, a rumpabat. I just love that word. It's just bursting out. This darned religion. It's bursting out. A rumpabat. Again. It says first in Judea, which is good because it locates the origins of Christianity historically in Judea, but we knew that anyway. But it then says off it goes to Rome. And it says some rumpabat, non modo per Judaeum, because it's not only from Judea, and not only in Judea, but originum eius mali, the place where this mali, this horrible thing, this evil came from, sed per urbe metiam, so through the city also, through Rome. And then it goes on and on about how all these awful things, everything awful comes to Rome. Oh, even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. Accordingly, so this is where Nero tells us how his scapegoating tactic was implemented. So accordingly, an arrest was made, first of all who pleaded guilty, then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Now, again, I'd say this English translation is trying to make it sound okay in English. Actually, it doesn't say pleaded guilty, it just says confessed. That's what it says in the Latin. They confessed, and the Latin's ambiguous. It could be that Tacitus is deliberately ambiguous, and maybe we shouldn't try and tie him down too much. But maybe they were confessing to the fire, maybe they were merely confessing to being Christians. Tacitus leaves it a bit vague. Maybe he's happy to do so, and maybe he wasn't sure. But you can nail your colours to the mast if you want to analyse the Latin this way or that. So a multitude was convicted, according to Tacitus. Now, no Christian source claims that there was a multitude in Rome. Paul wrote to a church there, so Tacitus may be exaggerating, or maybe there's nothing to say he was wrong, so maybe there really was a multitude by this point. There's no evidence that that's not true. Tacitus is just our only witness to it being a multitude. So it's unclear what they've confessed to, but it does talk about hatred of mankind, and that's key really. Tacitus says it's not so much of the crime of burning the city down as hatred of mankind. Now, the Jews were sometimes accused of this as well, and obviously Christianity came out of Judaism. Hatred of mankind seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? I think what we're really talking about is people who refuse to go along and cooperate with the Roman lifestyle. So much of it would involve respecting the Roman gods. If you went to the baths, if you did business, in almost any way you did life, it was religious. There wasn't really a secular life as such, and the Romans found the Christians avoiding the Roman baths, or at least the Roman temples. You had to get clean, but they would avoid temples and anything associated with their pagan religion, and this could seem quite antisocial, and so the charge of hatred of mankind. Now, it's interesting, because how could that be a criminal offence, you may be thinking, but this was not like the justice that we like to think of in the West today. Roman justice was not like that. Give an example. Cicero was a very famous Roman lawyer from the previous century and did criminal trials, and we've got some of his speeches that he wrote down. And I remember one of them. He was defending a murderer, and he doesn't try and say that the murderer is innocent of the charge. He more or less accepts that, my client did it. But he puts up this robust defence on the grounds of but the other guy was really awful, and my guy, he's not so bad. And that was valid, almost for Cicero to try and get his guy off on the basis that the other guy deserved it. My guy is, by comparison, is nowhere near as bad as that guy. And that was the defence. So rather than the defence being what are the facts, Cicero would actually construct his speech on the basis of the guy had it coming to him. And Tacitus here, you can almost see the same attitude of, they were not so much convicted of possibly of burning down the city as hatred of mankind, or at least that's why people hated them. So it's a different attitude to why you should be punished. There's more of an attitude of, they had it coming to them, those Christians, because they hated mankind, and all that really means is they didn't take part in Roman pagan religious rituals, probably, or anything that would have gone with it, because the entire Roman ritual was oil the wheels. It was, you know, that's how business got done. And if you didn't join in, for one thing, you were probably going to be poor, and a lot of the Christians were poor. Now Tacitus picks up the story again. So yeah, they were convicted of hatred against mankind. Is that what? Anyway, Tacitus leaves it vague, and then he says, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with the skins of beasts. They were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination. When daylight had expired, Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer, or stood aloft in a car. Not a car as in, you know, but a car that went behind the Romans pulled it, chariots and stuff. Never mind. The point is, Tacitus here is really making a big deal out of connecting Nero with the fire. So Nero is rumoured to have started the fire. He blames the Christians for it. Then when the Christians are getting this brutal treatment, Nero is making sure everyone sees that he's celebrating the punishment of these evil wrongdoers. And Tacitus is really bigging this up so that we all think that it's Nero. It was Nero the whole time. So there's an interesting thing about this description of punishment, what Tacitus does and doesn't say, which makes it distinctly not a Christian forgery. Some people have tried to say, is this a Christian forgery? If this was a Christian forgery, this is the point where you would spot it, because this description of the executions, not only does it say really nasty things about Christians, about their hatred of mankind, no Christian's going to write that. Especially in those days, in those centuries, no Christian was going to say, oh, we're all guilty of hatred of mankind, and we've got a mischievous superstition from the place where evil comes from. No Christian's going to say that for a start. But then in these martyrdom scenes, Tacitus doesn't see it as martyrdom, he just sees it as execution. They were torn by dogs, perished, nailed to crosses, doomed to the flames, burned, covered with the skins of beasts. The one thing that you would do with this, if it was a Christian martyrdom story, and we've got Christian martyrology literature, we know what it looks like, we know what Christians wrote their martyrdom stories like, and at this point it would say something like, if it was a forgery, it would say something like, these poor guys, they're dying, but as they're dying, they're praying to Jesus, and they see the heavens open and angels appear, and they look like angels themselves. Everyone's taken aback, everyone in the stadium remarking how amazingly virtuous they really are, and how what they're dying for must be true, and they see Jesus speaks to them, or something like that. Those are the touches of Christian martyrology stories, usually borrowing from the story of Stephen in the New Testament. None of that is here. There is nothing like that. So this is not a martyrology story written by a Christian. There is no upbeat note, there is nothing they can take away from it. It just ends with them being covered with the skins of beasts and torn by dogs and perished, nailed to crosses and so on. So Tacitus might be enjoying writing this, but anyway, it's interesting to see where he takes this next, because he knows the scapegoats, he said so. And what he wants to tell us as we come to the end of this bit is that it backfires on Nero. This is really all about Nero, and it backfires on him. So Tacitus continues. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. To glut one man's cruelty, they were being destroyed. Nero, Nero, Nero. That's what Tacitus is really saying. And that's it, that's the passage. That's all we get about Christ and Christians. So he says more, it's interesting from a sort of point of view historian looking at what it says about Christians, really, because Tacitus was a contemporary of these Christians. Whether he was in Rome at the time, we don't know. But he's told us quite a bit. And if we're looking at it from the origins of Christianity, things we take away from it are that the movement started in Judea before Christ's death, it got going again. After his death, it was a death in the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, done by Pontius Pilate, and then the movement spread to Rome. And that's pretty much what it tells you from the origins of it, and then about the punishment of Christians. And it's very there's no fanciful stories of the exploits of Christ or Christians. Tacitus doesn't seem to know what Christians actually believe or what they do. He just has all this nasty tone about it. So it's really not a history of Christ and Christians. It's just from a Roman perspective, what did we do? We killed Christ and then we killed the Christians. And if we killed Christ, it must be he's an executed criminal. That's what it implies. And if we killed Christians, yeah, it's because Nero made them escape, but what the heck, they were awful people anyway. And then that's pretty much it. So if you want to know what Tacitus' his attitude to Christ and Christians was, that's it. I hope you... So it leaves time for just a few final thoughts. Where did Tacitus get his information from about Christ and about Christians? They're two separate questions. What happened to Christ? The Romans did it to him in Judea. What happened to these Christians, this group of Christians? The Romans did it to them in Rome, decades apart. So we're not talking about one source. On the former, it's difficult to say. People have put forward suggestions. No one knows the answer. And if anyone says they do know, take it with a pinch of salt. The alternatives put forward are Roman sources, Christian sources, Jewish sources, and I think that covers it. Roman, Jewish and Christian sources that basically cover it in one way or another. So Jewish sources, the only one that is named would be Josephus. He was a historian alive at the same time as Tacitus, but Josephus was Jewish, Tacitus was Roman. Two historians both wrote about the Jewish war. So you might think, oh, they'd know about each other. But they never mention each other. And nothing in their books really gives the impression that they did read each other's works at all. So speculation, but it's possible that these two people never met and never compared notes. The world has always been a bigger place than we imagine it. It's just possible, but we don't know. If they had met, you'd think that Josephus would have told Tacitus some of where he was going wrong, because Tacitus is on the whole a very good, very careful historian, qualifies things he's not sure of. When he talks about the origins of the Jews, Tacitus writes utter tosh, and you would think if he'd met Josephus, he wouldn't have written such tosh, because Josephus was a Jew who actually wrote a book on the antiquities of the Jews, and Tacitus obviously hadn't read it. So to have been writing such tosh about the origins of the Jews. So that's Tacitus probably not consulting Josephus. There are other Jews. Tacitus had been out east in the Roman Empire, and there's certainly a lot more Jews than there were Christians. Some Christians were Jews, some were not, but in any case there were more Jews than Christians. So it's possible that some Jewish people told him their version of events. People were talking about Christians, so you might have got different people's points of views. It doesn't mean he's got Christians' point of view about Christians. He may have got Jewish people telling him what they thought, possibly to make trouble for Christians, because that seems to have happened. Or it could be other Roman officials who'd served out in the East who gave Tacitus their opinion of what had happened, and we just don't know. There are also official records. There may have been Jewish sources, there may have been Roman sources. In terms of Roman literary sources that we know exist but don't survive, there was the Acta Diurna, which was the equivalent of a daily newspaper, but it wasn't. There was no printing press, but as such, but not in the modern sense. But they would produce the daily news, and it would be posted up in the forum or wherever, and copies of it would be taken around the empire for Romans to read. So it'd be something for the Roman soldiers in the barracks around the empire to read. And this is the Acta Diurna, which would be sort of local daily news, and it might include some notices from things from far-flung parts of the empire, and there would probably have been in the library in Rome. And same goes for the Acta Senatus, the Acts of the Roman Senate, which is they're the records of the Roman Senate. But none of these survived 2,000 years later. They were probably made on, papyrus, and not the sort of papyrus that is going to survive unless there are very, very unusual conditions for preserving them, like burying them in peat or something, which is all right at Hadrian's Wall, but doesn't happen everywhere, if you get the reference. So there are these sort of records which Tacitus would have had access to, but we can't test that because we don't have them. Even if he had them, he had them, we don't. So we can't really test that. So all these things are speculation. So, and you can try and put together a theory on what you think is the most likely source, but you have to concede that it includes a good deal of speculation. For my part, I think the official Roman sources are the best option. I don't think Christian sources, because Tacitus seems to know absolutely nothing about what Christians actually do or believe. He only connects them with a person called Christ, what the Romans did to Christ. That's it. He really, he'll have heard of Christians, but whether he met a real one, goodness only knows. Probably not Josephus, because Tacitus comes out with tosh that Josephus wouldn't have come out with. But certainly Jewish sources on the ground, unnamed Jewish sources on the ground during his time out east. That's pretty probable. Certainly official Roman sources and unofficial Roman sources on the ground while out east. Very possible. Put all together, and Tacitus has got all kinds of knowledge about all kinds of things. That's why he was able to write books like the Annals, which include and Tacitus' books on the history of the war with Israel. But we just simply can't nail down every single bit of it and say, we got this bit of the book from this person. It's a tiny, tiny part of his work. He's not going to go to huge lengths. Bear in mind, he's researching and enjoying researching and writing very, very large volumes of works of the history of Rome and the Jewish wars. Chances are it's cropped up in his research, and nothing more exciting than that. So I hope you enjoyed this look at Tacitus and what he says about Christ and Christians. Thanks again, and hope to catch you again soon.